Thanks for having me, and thanks to the EcoDistricts, everybody, for coming out today. It's exciting to be here, and it's a great morning in Denver. It's got a little chilly, which is good for me, coming from Atlanta. I'm kind of tired of summer, so it's good to be here. It's great to be among my people, I can tell, because we're talking about geeky stuff like infrastructure and metrics and data and all of that, but we're putting it in the context of people and their lives, and that's what I'm interested in. So this idea of building vibrancy, building places that are equitable, resilient, sustainable, healthy, and all that is really sort of right in my wheelhouse. So it's great to be here and share my story with you, and over the course of the day, next couple of days, really hopefully get to know also what you're up to. I did write this book, and the title I think is up there now. Yep. It's Reclaiming Infrastructure for a New Generation of Cities. This is about reclaiming infrastructure as not only the functional aspects of our lives, but it's the foundation for our economy and our culture and our social life. And I didn't realize when I started writing a book about infrastructure that it was going to end up being a story about my grandma, but there she is. It's pretty cool. Because when we start talking about infrastructure, we're really talking about stories, and that the story of cities can be told through our infrastructure. And I started learning about that when I was in college. I did a year abroad in Paris when I was 22. This is what I still look like when I look in the mirror in the morning. But my friend of mine says I look like a French anarchist, which is fine too. But it was a great time to be in Paris, of course, when you're that young, and reframe the way that you see the world, and really particularly focus in on infrastructure and the role that it plays in our lives, that it's not just about moving from point A to point B, it's not just about conveying water and sewer or energy or whatever, but literally it is a foundation for our economy and for our social life and for our culture. Literally, when Napoleon III plowed the grand boulevards through the heart of medieval Paris, he created a new way of life for people. Impressionist painters were literally painting the light that was now streaming down into the city streets. The broad sidewalks enabled the cafe life that spurred on the arts and culture and everything that Paris is really known for. And that iconic image of Paris was built by lots of things, but at its foundation, it was built by infrastructure. And really, came home and started really looking at cities and the layers of infrastructure and that built the great cities of this country. Through industrialization, we built entirely new layers that built a different kind of city that met different demands and opportunities for our economy, for our livelihoods, for everything. They often came at costs for some people and benefits for others, and they destroyed things and they created thif but this idea that infrastructure is intentional and that it affects our lives and it shapes our lives, and that if all we build are highways and off-ramps, then guess what? We're going to end up with a life our lives are going to be dominated by cars. And so really got interested in that and the way of life that those investments start to create. And cities, even in the beginning of sprawl, were at the beginning of highway expansion and suburbanization. We had a cultural view of what cities were about, and most people wanted to get away from them. And we started creating the infrastructure as a result to get away from them. And we did. And that's where my grandma comes back into the story. My grandparents were in Alexandria, Louisiana. My grandfather was a banker when they got married in 1941. When they got married, his boss convinced him to buy a house out on the edge of town. This could be Levittown, this could be anywhere, but it's in Alexandria, Louisiana. And they did, and they drove out to the edge of town and bought a new house with no sidewalks and little tree in the front yard. And I don't know that they got one of those fancy FHA loans that was only available to white people, but they probably did. And they were part of that story of American suburbanization that really fundamentally changed the way that we built our lives. We were building the foundations for sprawl at that time, of course, but we didn't call it that. We just called it the future. And it was. And even with all of its challenges and downsides and the people who weren't part of its benefit, you can't separate the construction of the physical world around us from the culture and what was also happening in our lives at that time. While we were building those highways, science was curing disease and lifting us to the moon, and the sexual revolution was breaking down barriers, and the civil rights movement began its march toward the fulfillment of our nation's promise. The cultural context of that effort of city building are inextricably linked in a really powerful way. And including my own story, my parents moved our family from Louisiana to Metro Atlanta in 1974 to take advantage of the booming economy that was a direct result of all those new highways that we were building. Literally, we bought a house in a neighborhood that was incentivized by the construction of our perimeter highway. My dad took a job with an engineering firm designing pump stations, wastewater treatment plants to support the sprawling economy of the region. It literally put dinner on our table and sent me to college. And those benefits, again, were not available to everyone, and it's important to keep reminding ourselves of that. But those highways did what infrastructure and city building are supposed to do. They build a way of life for us. And that fundamentally changed the way that we live our lives, not always for the better. It's a way of life for a lot of people. And so, I got back from Paris that year abroad and drove on the top end of 285 for that summer, good to my job. I'm really fascinated by the role of infrastructure, not only in our daily life, but in the economic desolation, in terms of its social isolation, environmental degradation. You look at the political polarization that we're facing right now in this country, and it's hard to separate it from the physical construction and separation of us from each other. Sprawl is not only separating people working and living, or people who make one income or another, or going to the park over here or shopping over there. We're separating ourselves from each other. And in the process, we're not building empathy and learning to understand and love each other in ways that help us make better decisions. And so that's kind of the context within that this sprawl mindset of myself, my worldview being framed by that perimeter highway, was a context within which the Atlanta Beltline came to life. I went back to graduate school for architecture and urban planning and reimagined this loop of old railroads as a new infrastructure that would move Atlanta to the next level and take it and create something new to create a new way of life for people in the city. So it's fairly close in. It's only 3 miles out from downtown in any direction. It's 22 miles long. These are old freight railroad lines that were built out in the country surrounding the city after the Civil War to expand the industrial base of the city. All the yellow land is the old industrial property that followed along these railroads. And then, of course, the city expanded well beyond the Beltline through suburbanization and left this industrial belt behind for generations. But there's 45 neighborhoods along the way on one side of the tracks or the other, and all that land adds up to about 4,000 acres of prime land right in the heart of the city, ready for something new. And so the idea is to take this loop of old railroads and transform it into a transit line that connects to our existing MARTA rail service. And then ultimately a trail was added to the idea that would connect the emerging trail network. So the 22-mile transit and trail for the entire loop corridor, revitalizing communities along the way and spurring on the economic development of all that land. And you can see how close it is to the city. It's relatively close. A lot of it just looks like this. I mean, you could be out in the country and you're literally 3 miles from downtown Atlanta. You can see how it works where you've got the abandoned railroad corridor in the middle, flanked on either side by pretty obsolete industrial land, and then the neighborhoods that Atlanta's a neighborhood city, and it really loves that about itself and identifies in that way. So, I just had this idea, and I went to work for an architecture firm. We were getting a lot of work doing multi-use redevelopment of a lot of this property because people were starting to move back into the city. And I was telling my coworkers about this idea I had in school, and they thought it was cool. So we started talking about it to more people, and the more people we talked to, the more people wanted to hear about it. This is the summer of 2001. We sent out a letter with some maps and to everybody we could think of, the governor, the mayor, all the regional planning agencies. Got some nice letters back saying good luck with that. But got one response from Kathy Willard. She's on city council, chair of the transportation committee, and she was frustrated that there was nothing in any of the regional plans for transit for people who live in the city, who are more likely to want it, more likely to ride it, more likely to pay for it, have been paying for it for 30 years with MARTA at that time. And a large proportion of people who are dependent on transit to get around because they can't afford a car. There's really nothing for them. So she went back to her office one day after a meeting like that, and this letter was on her desk. And she called us in. We told her more about the idea. We did a town hall meeting in her district, and the people of Atlanta fell in love with this story. Now, it's a much longer story than I have time to tell right now, but basically, we would not be building this project if the people of Atlanta hadn't fallen in love with a vision around infrastructure for their future, which is really powerful. I could bore you to death with all of the things that it took to get it off the ground, but at the core was a constituent group of community people, developers, an environmental group, which I mean sort of the nonprofit sector of Atlanta, advocating on any number of issues. You know that these groups aren't usually at the same table wanting the same outcome. But there we were. It was really weird, but it's also really powerful, and it made a lot of other things possible. It started a lot of other conversations around other people. It brought a lot of other ideas to the table. It took our core idea about transportation along the loop and economic development and connecting existing parks and green space, expanded to become all kinds of other things, including 1,400 acres of new parks, the largest affordable housing initiative in the city's history, community stabilization and arboretum, preservation and public art strategies and public health. And I mean, the idea just expanded well beyond what anybody ever thought it could be. And of course, because cities are complex and projects like this are complex, it requires a real mess of organizations and agencies and partners to pull it off. So it's painful in a lot of ways, but it's also the thing that makes it worthwhile. And so the Beltline is a lot of pretty pictures. We got a lot of nice drawings. But it's also happening. This is the first section, the East Side Trail, 2 miles of the 22. So we're still very much in the early stages of implementation. But you can see how it's working, and it is working. We've spent about $450 million so far, mostly on land acquisition and parks and trail construction. In the same time period, we've seen over $3 billion of private sector development as a direct result, which is staggering, including this building, which is the largest building in the southeastern United States. It's 2 million square feet, an old Sears and Roebuck distribution building right on the Beltline, directly next to a future transit station, that's been completely transformed with a market hall and offices and retail. If you've been to Chelsea Market in New York, this is the same developer right here doing the similar idea. If you're there, stop by. I've got a little office and a co-working space in there too. But this, you can see the building in the background, and this is what this corridor looked like just a few years ago. This is basically what it looks like today. I took this picture when I was out taking my kids for a bike ride, and I was in the back taking pictures with my phone, trying not to have a wreck. And when I got home, I was flipping through the pictures. I realized this is my favorite picture I've taken in 16 years of working on this project. And it's not because it's a beautiful day in spring. It's not because people are literally walking by talking about how in love they are with their city again. It's this woman on the right. She's carrying her groceries, and in the process, she's validating everything that we always said that the Beltline would do, that it's changing the way that we live our lives in Atlanta. It's making a way of life possible that wasn't before. And the transit's not even done, and the shoulder's not done. The ramps and stairs aren't there. There's a Whole Foods right off the picture. You can't even get to it. It's ridiculous how much it's already changing our lives, and we're very, very far from being done. There's no transit yet. The trail is, maybe it's 3 miles so far. We got another 4 under construction, but we got a ways to go. And of course, it's part of our lives. So rather than the worldview of 285, like I grew up, my kids are growing up on the Beltline, so much that when they were complaining about having to go to the grocery store the other day, they said, "Dad, if we have to go, can we at least ride our bikes?" And I was like, "Of course we can ride our bikes." That's what people in Atlanta do. We ride our bikes to the grocery store, They don't know how ridiculous that is, but and that's good, and that it gives you a sense for how much is possible, because they're coming with the different expectations, not only of what Atlanta's about, but what their lives are going to be about, which is really cool. So that idea of the personal story and narrative as part of our larger story of infrastructure and city building, the humanizing aspect of all the geeky, wonky, technical infrastructure kind of stuff that we all work on is really important to put it in context that people understand so that they make better decisions. And organically across the country, we're doing that. I have the benefit of traveling places like Denver and sharing our story, and every city I go to has something going on. So whether it's the High Line, and the book really connects our story with the Beltline to this larger story, whether it's the High Line in New York, or the rail park in Philadelphia, or the not only railroads, it's a power line project called the Green Line in Toronto, the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis, which is like the Beltline, existing trail, future transit on the left. Same thing in Detroit, the DeQuinder Cut, existing trail, future transit. In Salt Lake City, they built the transit. In Singapore, they got a 15-mile railroad across their whole country island. They see the Beltline as their primary example of what they want to do, which is amazing. In New Orleans, the Lafitte Corridor. In Miami, the Underline. Right here in Denver, I was here back in December. I looked at the Highline Canal project, which is beautiful. In Houston, the bayous are being reinvented around these new greenways. And I'm in love with the LA River. I mean, who even knew LA had a river, except every post-apocalyptic movie coming out of Hollywood. But it's beautiful, I think, in its existing condition. But ever since the 80s, there's been this grassroots movement to transform it into some kind of life-affirming infrastructure again. And to tell you what kind of catalyst these projects are creating, the Army Corps of Engineers, which paved the LA River, paved it in the 1930s, paved 80% of a 50-mile-long river with concrete. Just agreed a couple years ago to a $1 billion restoration of one short piece of the Glendale Narrows. So the catalyst, it's not only changing the physical form of cities, it's changing the way that we think about cities, but also, importantly, how our private sector and public sector start to build and create the decisions that they make about it. The Federal Highway Administration didn't exist before there were highways. As we start to catalyze this sort of momentum of change, we're going to be changing the way that those agencies, business models, and everything do business, which is really exciting. In Montreal, the Lachine Canal, in Memphis, the Harahan Bridge. I mean, these projects just keep going on, and I'm running out of time, so I can go quickly. But the idea is that we're building more than just infrastructure. We're catalyzing a new way of life that makes it possible. All these sort of things possible. And to end, I want to say, not to get too cheesy on you, but why this is important. And you know this intuitively, but it's not just my kids. But it is my kids personally. That they're, we've got a lot of challenges ahead, and we have to tell a story about infrastructure that resonates with people so that they'll make better decisions. And so I don't usually play the violin walking down the trail, tugging my dog in the back of a cooler. But this woman is out there all the time, and she's living the life that she wants, and in the process, she's making life more interesting for all of us. And I love her as an example of the ability to create infrastructure that works for people and the kind of lives that they want. That's what I'm interested in. Personally, I live on the Beltline, I work on the Beltline, my kids are on the Beltline all the time. We ride our bike to the grocery store. I go to my sweet dog's last walk was on the Beltline, and every season, people not just out there for exercise or for commuting, but also going out on dates. I mean, women in serious heels. People are organizing their lives around this in a really profound way that's really beautiful, I think. And there's my daughter on the right. That's her worldview. That's your average weekday afternoon, which is amazing. It's not even done. This is a woman I met in the unbuilt part of the Beltline. She's like, oh yeah, transit trails, parks, blah, blah, blah. What she's excited about with the Beltline was the economy that it was going to bring to her community. She's a new business owner. She has a fashion designer. You can see the models in the background. This project is going to do for her and her family what those highways did for me and my family. It's going to build an economy for her that would support her. And that's just really profound. And you missed it last Saturday, but the Lantern Parade, another great story about infrastructure. The Lantern Parade was this crazy idea that a parade is something that you participate in, not merely watch, that people would make homemade lanterns and walk down the trail in the dark. And the first year there were 200 people, and the second year there were 400 people, and the next year there were 800 people, and then there were 1,200 people, and then there were 12,000 people. and then there were 20,000 people. Last year, there were over 60,000 people, and last Saturday, I don't know the number yet, but it had to be more than that. So it's really fascinating to see something that happened that wouldn't be happening without infrastructure. It's illustrating a pent-up demand for some other way of life for people. So when you look ahead at all the big challenges that we're facing as a country, not only in Atlanta, but everywhere, it's exciting to think that we can do this, that we can actually accomplish something big. And make this a better place. All we have to do, not to be too cheesy again, is to believe in ourselves. We have to look each other in the eye. We're going to disagree about things, but we can do it. But ultimately, we have to act. We have to do things. And no matter whether we disagree or not, all of us together are building a cultural momentum that is fundamentally changing the way that we build cities, hopefully for the better. So thank you all for doing that kind of work, and thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to be here. Thanks.